For Pacifica Radio, July 11th, 2024. I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Antiwar Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm editorial director of Antiwar.com, and I'm the author of the book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. You can find my full interview archive, more than 6,000 of them now, going back to 2003, at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show and all your favorite podcatchers and video websites /Scott Horton Show and so forth. And of course, I'm here every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK. All right, so our guest today is the great Kyle Anzalone from the Institute and Antiwar.com. Welcome back to the show, Kyle. How you doing?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me back on.
Very happy to have you here. Did I ever tell you how much I love listening to your podcast, Conflicts of Interest? It's so good. I'm jealous. All of my guys are kind of leaving me in the dust here, but you give me reason to try hard. So, which just means having you on the show to tell me all the horrible stuff that you've been learning lately. And of course, especially focusing on Israel-Palestine. And let's start with this. I kind of get the idea, Kyle, that people stop paying attention to the Israel-Palestine thing. All the college students are out for the summer, and I guess the tempo of the bombing has somewhat been curtailed. I don't want to overstate that, but, or maybe it's just summertime blues or what, I don't know, but it seems like it's kind of fading from people's consciousness. So we got to do our part to make sure to keep people paying attention, because the war is absolutely not over, which itself is just remarkable when you look at the size of the Gaza Strip and the alleged might of the IDF to carry out a war in 9 months' time here. But anyway, what's your take on that? Do you think that attention has begun to wane, or that's just me?
No, I think maybe you are somewhat correct, Scott. I think the college students not being there probably has a little bit of an impact on how much this is a story in the American news cycle day after day, because the college students, you know, they have crackdowns by police and things like that, which really draws in the media attention. And of course, the bigger story is the war in Gaza. And so they have to provide some coverage to that too. Now, I imagine that's going to step up in the coming weeks, especially as we have the DNC convention coming up in Chicago. It seems that there's a lot of activists within the left wing of American politics more generally, right? I'm not trying to give anybody a label, just anybody who might be involved with the DNC or as a progressive, a leftist, something like that, seem to be wanting to show up in Chicago and do a big protest there. And so I think that will probably get it more in the spotlight. But I think the other issue is, Scott, is after Biden's debate debacle, a lot of the coverage in the United States is now around, is he even going to be the Democratic nominee? Which is really unfortunate, because the discussion should be, is he competent enough to really assess if Israel using American weapons for war crimes in Gaza? Because if that was the discussion, then I think we would realize that our president isn't competent enough to decide that. And we should all look for ourselves and see that what's going on in Gaza is absolutely horrific. And I'm not quite so sure the pace of the bombing has slowed down, Scott. One thing that happened is Israel reduced Rafah to rubble. And so I think that really reduced the access that Palestinians within Gaza had to the outside world through sharing videos and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, and I know, I mean, it was a deliberate campaign. It was explicitly documented, very well documented in the Israeli press, that they were murdering journalists and their families, but specifically targeting journalists in order to prevent the dissemination of all that video footage coming out of there. So, yeah, no surprise. And, you know, you're right, and it almost seems like a trivial issue compared to what we're talking about here, but of course it is a huge part of it, that Biden's not just old, right? He has dementia. He's out of his mind, and he has been this whole time, as anyone who's not married to the Democratic Party could tell you. And so the same media that's been lying to us this whole time and pretending that that's not so are the same ones who are, as you say, now saying, well, the only issue is, Can he finish out another 4 years, this and that? No one on TV news is saying, man, maybe we really need to reassess the shots that this guy has been calling this whole time. Like when he swears, and we all know it's not true, that Putin told the world that he was coming for Poland next once he was done in Ukraine, which is not true. And Biden apparently has based his whole policy on that. Or as you're saying, this policy that, yes, of course, Israel can have a blank check to bomb whoever they want. And we'll do everything in the world to protect them diplomatically and the rest. Maybe you've got to be demented to go along with that. Did anybody on TV ever think of that?
Right. And Biden said publicly that he saw images of beheaded babies, of Israeli beheaded babies from October 7th. And we know that that did not occur. And he made that up. His own White House has had to admit that. He's also repeated a lot of other, the most elaborate Israeli falsehoods. And not to say that atrocities were not committed on October 7th by Hamas. But the larger point here, Scott, is that the president is going off of, and he believes, the very worst of the Israeli atrocity propaganda from October 7th. And it's largely been proven untrue.
Yeah. And look, part of his dementia, clearly, and this applies to others as well sometimes, is he gets all angry and starts poking people in the chest and whatever. He don't want to hear it about anything. So the same people who are afraid to tell him that, Mr. President, you have to stay up till 6:30 tonight because there's something important happening or whatever, are the same people who are afraid to tell him probably that, Mr. President, that line of yours about how Putin vowed to conquer the rest of Europe as soon as possible, like you do know that that's not true, right? Like, of course, you can tell whatever lie you want, but you know that that's really not right? Because he didn't say that. And we've reread the speech numerous times, and including our Russia speakers, and he didn't say that. Who ever told him that? Did anybody tell him that? Can Sullivan or Blinken tell him that, or would they even want to? Seems kind of important when you're talking about, conflict with Russia based on total inanities as the, basis of the policy here. And then, of course, the absolute ultra-violence going on in Palestine. And who knows, if Joe Biden was in his right mind, it might be worse, right? He might send in the Marines or something. I don't know. Real Joe Biden was a real bad guy before he lost his mind. So it's kind of no telling. But
right. In all these points aren't to absolve Joe Biden of anything. He is a lifelong Zionist, and that is something he's proudly touted in his career. And so there's no reason to think that Joe Biden wouldn't have done this if he wasn't the president. However, it does explain how convoluted the policy has seemed at times. Like through the first 7 months of this conflict, the Biden administration was trying to end the war by getting a massive deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize ties as Israel is committing this onslaught in Gaza, something that was very obvious Saudi Arabia would never go along with as long as Israel was waging this war. And then at the beginning of June, the Biden administration was saying that we're going to de-escalate the situation in Lebanon by getting a ceasefire deal in Gaza. And when it became clear that wasn't happening, a week later, the White House is saying that, well, any deal to de-escalate in Lebanon has to be separate from a deal in Gaza. And it's just completely convoluted and is no basis for diplomacy whatsoever. And I'm sure part of what the United States is doing is why this war is dragging out and lagging on just so long.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Yeah, it's certainly not to absolve him. And of course, he has his moments of lucidity. He knows what he's doing. It certainly doesn't absolve him of responsibility at all. But it does make sense then why he would do and say things that don't make sense all the time and be completely inconsistent and base his policies on things that nobody ever said and God knows what, because he is nuts Joe Biden, You had horrible Joe Biden, and then you turned him nuts. No, he's horrible and nuts. It's not good.
And just to add to that, Scott, we don't have sanity behind the scene and adults in the room that are actually effectively governing while Joe Biden is just up there bumbling and mumbling on. We have Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and the rest of them that just seem to take marching orders and carry on with the same convoluted policy that the White House has put out. It was about 2 months ago now. The White House said that Israel had agreed to a ceasefire proposal in Gaza, and immediately Netanyahu said that Israel did not agree to that and that Israel is not going to end the war in Gaza permanently. And yet, from the top down in the White House, they're all repeating that Israel has agreed to a ceasefire that Israel has explicitly not agreed to. And so not only is the president demented, but the entire White House is just willing to walk along with it.
Yeah. And then, by the way, did you see this thing? I think I sent you this from MJ Rosenberg, who is a progressive and famously used to work for AIPAC and has a grudge and is, a great anti-Israel lobby guy. And he's got a great Substack. And didn't I send you this thing about how Joe Biden's Israeli advisor is an Israeli advisor? And that's who is telling Biden what's going on. His name is Amos Hochstein. And he's apparently coming in and telling Joe Biden about what his Israel policy should be.
Right. So since October 7th, it seems that behind the scenes, the two people who have the most influence on Joe Biden's Middle East policy are Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein. And I would say 3 or 4 months ago, James Carden wrote a really important article for us at antiwar.com. If you go back in his archives to probably January, you could find it there, where he details how Amos is just neck deep in the Israeli government. It's not just somebody who happened to have been born in Israel and then grew up in the United States and is effectively an American. This is somebody who you would definitely question where his loyalties and interests lie. And so, yeah, this is very problematic. And then months and months later, the Washington Post finally catches up with antiwar.com, of course, and we get this article detailing it. Scott, this doesn't seem to be a situation where Biden is leveraging this guy's Israeli past in order to force a deal on Netanyahu, right? Like, we have Amos Hochstein, who we clearly know is an anti-Semitic. He's not pro-Palestinian. And so if he's the one driving this agreement, it gives Joe Biden some right-wing or Israeli cover to really try to force Netanyahu into a corner. That's not what's happening here. What the Americans are saying to Hezbollah is they're not going to force Israel to do anything. Hezbollah has to completely back up and withdraw from the border with Israel and essentially admit and concede defeat, even as the war in Gaza is dragging on. It's something that the Hezbollah leadership has made very clear they're not willing to do. And so his policies that he's putting forward are either deliberately unattainable in order to just let Netanyahu drag this on as long as possible, or he's just so steeped in Israeli propaganda that he's incapable of negotiating a deal with Assad and Israel.
Hang on just 1 second for me here. You guys, I'm so proud to announce the publication of the Libertarian Institute's 14th book. It's Israel, winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War, Undue Influence, Deceptions, and the Neocon Energy Agenda by Gary Vogler, former senior oil consultant and deputy senior oil advisor for U.S. forces during Iraq War II. Remember how I wrote in Enough Already about how Ahmed Chalabi sold the neoconservatives on a plan to rebuild the old British oil pipeline from Mosul and Kirkuk, Iraq, to Haifa, Israel, if they would only get the United States to overthrow Saddam Hussein for him? And how they bought it because they are as dumb as they are corrupt? Well, Gary was there. As senior civilian consultant to the DoD and Iraqi oil ministry, he had a unique window and experience witnessing the Pentagon neocons and their machinations on behalf of Israel before and during that war. And it turns out that even though they did not get their pipeline, as Vogler demonstrates, the neocons and their Likudnik bosses figured out an effective plan B anyway. You are going to love Israel, winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War by Gary Vogler, available everywhere. Check it out along with our other great books at libertarianinstitute.org/books. Hey, y'all, let me tell you about Robertson Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Nobody trusts the U.S. dollar anymore. Foreign governments are stocking up on gold instead of $100 bills. 1, they know they need to, and 2, that means you need to too. Interest rates are up, but for some reason not much for savings accounts. Park your money there and watch Uncle Joe Biden just counterfeit its value away. You can see how the Fed is afraid to raise rates to beat inflation for fear of popping the current bubbles, at least before the election. so more inflation it will continue to be. Gold is your shield against monetary and price inflation, just like it always has been. Now, Tim Fry and the guys over at Roberts & Roberts are recommending gold over silver since the world's almost 200 governments are putting their own pressure on the price, which should help everyone else who makes similar calls on their own. Of course, Roberts & Roberts can help you with platinum, palladium, and silver, as well as gold. Don't let the Fed and the war party inflate all your savings away. Look up Roberts & Roberts at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. It's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Kyle Anzalone from Antiwar.com. And, you know, it's misleading, not your fault. It is what it is, and it's how we talk. But it is misleading to even call what's happening in Gaza a war at all, which, I mean, on one hand, the Hamas guys are resisting where the Israelis are within range of their pot-shot weapons. I mean, there is a fight going on. But we're talking about a sovereign nation state fighting an Indian reservation, right? This is not a war between nations. And people say, why are you singling out Israel? Well, this is a pretty unique circumstance, what they're doing. It's essentially a canned hunt. It'd be like if you walled off an American county and then went to war against it. That's what it is. And so you can call it that, but as Bill Hicks said, a war is when two armies are fighting. This is more of a horrific slaughter, ethnic cleansing campaign. Some call it a genocide. As we've discussed on the show, you know, they have killed and destroyed a Dresden worth of people there over months, not over 2 nights, you know, in one big firestorm, but still. And the Wall Street Journal even compares it to Dresden and Hamburg. And this is not funny, and it's not a marginal thing. It's a huge deal, and it's a huge deal in American politics. It should be. I mean, the polls, wasn't it right, Kyle, that the polls had something between 70 and 80% of Democrats wanted a ceasefire yesterday, right?
Yep. 40% of Democrats said Biden is giving Israel too much support. So the Democrat support for Israel has definitely been waning on this. And Scott, even Israeli officials have effectively compared this to Dresden. That's what Netanyahu has said. Well, look what you did in Dresden to give him the clearance to do what he's doing in Gaza.
Unbelievable. I know. Yeah, they go, well, you can burn all of Tokyo to the ground. I mean, hey, they got a point about that. Zora Neale Hurston called Truman the butcher of Asia. Who could dispute that? But now that's the benchmark. Whatever America did in World War II is the benchmark. But wait a minute. After that was the Geneva Conventions. And look, speaking of all of that, I noted it's on antiwar.com today about how Netanyahu coming to the United States has to skip refueling in Europe because he's afraid that he's going to get arrested. And I've never been a supporter of the ICC until, I don't know, this morning. But now I'm considering it. I at least think it's good for a yuck. But why would they do that? He's been indicted by the ICC as a war criminal. And that might sound crazy to people who don't know what's going on. But then again, I was looking at the internet yesterday. I'm sure you saw. It's unbelievable footage. These guys are playing soccer in a parking lot. And Netanyahu bombed them and blew them to pieces. And it's all right there in high definition 4G video.
Mm-hmm.
So, hence the indictment, you know?
Right. So just a little clarity about that. I believe the prosecutor at the ICC, the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, has requested the court issue the indictment arrest warrant for Netanyahu. I don't believe the court has actually issued that arrest warrant, but it's sitting out there is enough to effectively make it so, and Netanyahu is treating it as if that arrest warrant already exists, because I guess they could, unveil it as his plane is in the air or something like that and arrest him when he touches down on Italy or Spain or however he's flying to the U.S. Yeah. And by the way, that article was by our friend Connor Freeman at the Institute. Mm-hmm. And Netanyahu is so afraid of this arrest warrant that he has to just completely skipped over Europe to fly to the United States for his big speech in D.C., which just goes to show how horrific the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress are. They're planning to give Netanyahu dozens of standing ovations as he addresses Congress. And at the same time, the rest of the world is absolutely disgusted at what's going on. You mentioned that soccer game. I believe this was in an area of Khan Yunis, which is the region of Gaza that a lot of the Palestinians, there's about 1.3 million Palestinians sheltering in Rafah before Israel ordered the evacuation of that city and then destroyed it. And a lot of those people returned to Khan Yunis, which itself had been 80% destroyed by the previous military operations there. But about 2 weeks ago, they ordered all the Palestinians out of Khan Yunis once again. And so, Scott, it seems they really want to force the entire Palestinian population out of what were the existing population centers where there is some existing infrastructure that hasn't been destroyed, and force them all into these tent cities. And they also ordered the evacuation of Gaza City once again, which is where a good number, the majority of the people who are still in the northern half of the Gaza Strip are living. No idea where they're supposed to go. They're probably going to be forced into tents. And a lot of the residents of the city are saying at this point, they're not going to flee anymore. They would rather die in their homes than be forced out into the middle of the desert. Now, with the bombing of that school, 31 people were killed. And as you can see from the video, there are just young boys playing in a soccer game at the time the strike occurred. And I mean, this is just one of the most horrific things you could imagine. Like if this was Saturday morning in America and somebody went and set off a bomb at a, child soccer game, I mean, we would all be horrified. And that's exactly what's going on in Gaza. But this isn't just one time. It's almost a daily occurrence that Israel is bombing some sort of civilian targets. This was occurring in a UN-run school that is now serving as a shelter in Gaza. And so, these have been struck several times over the past couple of weeks.
Man, it's just sick. And look, I don't know. Maybe it's too much to ask people to care about people who live so far away, even though it's our government paying for all of it, providing all the weapons and the diplomatic support and every bit of it. Seems like that would matter enough. But how about this is what got the towers knocked down? It was Shimon Peres's invasion of Lebanon, including the Qana massacre where they killed a bunch of civilians in a school, 106 women and children in a UN shelter there in 1996, that motivated the hijackers to go and join Al-Qaeda. The same guys who ended up kamikazeing hijacked planes into those towers. That was what made them so angry that they chose to do it. And as Ron Paul warned, you think we can just go around the world bombing people without consequence, and we do that at our own peril. You're putting the people of this country in danger. Here's something that demented old Joe Biden can't seem to understand, and yet this was a headline in the New York Times last week, wasn't it, Kyle, that the American intelligence agencies are rightly worried about terrorist blowback from America helping the Israelis murder the Palestinians again.
Yeah, so this is a statement from Brett Holmgren, who has headed the State Department's intelligence agency since 2001. This is a real deep state cretin. He has worked with the CIA previously, the National Security Council previously. He worked at Capital One during the Trump administration when he was out of government. During that time, Barack Obama officiated the guy's wedding. So this is, a true deep state creature. And he is admitting that Israel's actions in Gaza are driving recruitment into international jihadist organizations. So I'm guessing this is like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or some of the groups in North Africa or in Iraq, Syria. And there could be a real risk to American soldiers from maybe terrorist attacks against them in the Middle East, even Saudi Arabia, something like that. But also could inspire lone wolf terrorist attacks, which is something that we saw the West was very vulnerable to during the rise of the Islamic State, where they were able to recruit people online who were already in the U.S. and other countries. And with all the migration that's been happening recently, wouldn't be surprised that they find ample recruits in different countries to go ahead and carry out these attacks. So there's a real risk to American security here, Scott. It's not, as Biden likes to say, Israel is so vital to American security that if it didn't exist, we would have to create it.
Yeah, it's absolutely the opposite of that. These guys could get in. There were a bunch of Tajiks who were arrested who had snuck across the border. Like, that's not Mexican migrant laborers. And they might be perfectly innocent Tajiks, but I don't know that. They very well could be extremely dangerous and our government is continually giving them, on one hand, aid and support in some places, and on the other hand, motivating their violence against the people of this country, too. So it is really a dangerous situation.
Right. And Scott, can I have one more minute to talk about Holmgren?
Yeah, man.
So this guy is getting a promotion to the National Counterterrorism Council, and that's why I believe the Washington Post did this interview with him, and they also interviewed Victoria Nuland about him, who said some really nice words about how smart he is. But what she was touting, and the reason he's getting this promotion, Scott, is because the State Department Intelligence Agency was one of the only intelligence agencies in the U.S. to predict that Russia was going to invade Ukraine before February of 2022. And so they're saying that, oh, this guy is just so smart, he's so prescient and things like that. But if you actually look at what this means, it means the State Department knew that Russia was going to invade Ukraine before it invaded, and they still refused to negotiate with the Russians. And so rather than showing that this is, some great guy, I think it really shows how ineffectual he is and how much he must love conflict, where rather than taking the information that he had and passing it to the Ukrainians saying, you guys better prepare for war, he should have took that information, passed it to Blinken, and if he had to, go over his head to the president and say, Mr. President, we are actually talking about Russia invading Ukraine here. We have to do something to prevent this. He didn't do that. He just allowed it to happen.
Yeah. Or he did that and they said, yeah, that's what we want. We're going to weaken Russia by giving them a bunch of territory and giving them an excuse to build up a massive new military. They're Democrats. They don't know what they're doing, And that was clearly the strategy even before the war. So, but you're right that all these, State Department weenies and the rest of them who went along with this, they bear their share of the responsibility for this war for certain. And it's been an absolute catastrophe for those poor people, too. And so speaking of which, too, I want to make sure that we keep up with this about hunger in Gaza, because I know they're under a blockade, and I know that the aid efforts have been for naught. The pier, fell apart. The airdrops are a PR stunt. The border crossings are closed. But there's millions of people there with no ability to really create an economy of their own in this situation. So people laying down and dying, as you would think they might be, or how bad is it getting, and is anyone doing anything about it?
Yeah, there's definitely been at least 34 people who have succumbed to deprivation, almost all of them young children, since this war broke out. And those are the documented people who died in a hospital bed, where there were, people who were able to communicate with the Gazan authorities to report that this person died from this reason. International agencies are saying about 1 million Palestinians are on the brink of famine. And of course, once famine is declared, Scott, that doesn't mean that, now people don't have food to eat. A state of famine means that 2 per every 10,000 people are dying. And so if you're talking about 1 million people, you're talking about hundreds of people dying every single day to actually be in a state of famine. And so the population in Gaza is certainly on its way there, if it's not already there. It's just unclear because there's so little reporting going on.
Yeah.
Aid organizations are saying there are really no effective aid convoys getting into Gaza at this point. A big part of that is because Israel keeps displacing the population. And so say you set up some trucks to arrive at a food warehouse in Khan Yunis where you're going to prepare meals and feed the hundreds of thousands of people in that city. And then Israel declares they're restarting military operations there. It completely scuttles the entire effort to bring food to those people. And now that population is dispersed among other areas of Gaza, and they have to, kind of establish themselves once again. Aid agencies had to find them before they could start to even plan the logistics of getting the trucks to where they need to go to feed the hungry and starving people of Gaza. And so that's a major part of the problem, is just the intensity, how widespread the Israeli operations are in Gaza at this point, and how dispersed the people are, makes it very difficult to get food to them. As you mentioned, the pier has completely fallen apart. I think there's a little bit of aid left in Cyprus and on the floating pier that's out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And so they're going to bring that aid into Gaza, where it's going to sit in the Nazarene corridor that's controlled by Israel until probably it expires. Maybe eventually one of these UN organizations will disperse it. But for the most part, all the aid that's gotten into Gaza through the pier has not gotten to the people. Some of it's been looted, some of it's been attacked, but most of it is just sat in the warehouses.
Yeah. I mean, I've been reading articles for months about people eating grass and leaves off of trees and trying to make some kind of soup out of the mud and this kind of just absolute desperation, like, Ethiopia in the 80s or something. So, and that's been quite a while ago. So, we definitely need to keep track of that as best as we possibly can. I know, as you said, information coming out of there is limited, but it's certainly a horrible and desperate situation. And I'm sorry, we're all out of time, but thank you so much for your time on the show. As always, Kyle, you're great.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, you guys, that is Kyle Anzalone. He's at the Institute at antiwar.com, and he hosts the incredible podcast, Conflicts of Interest. And that's it for the show today. I'm Scott Horton. I'm here every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. See you next week.